am Monica Meyers, and I was 16 years old the year my mother was taken from me in two separate moments. The first happened inside a hospital room that carried the scent of antiseptic and wilting flowers. The second came 14 days later, when my father stepped out of his truck with a woman I had never seen, set his hand on her back as though she already belonged there, and told me to say hello. I could not find my voice that evening. I stood on the porch in my mother's old cardigan and watched a stranger carry a small suitcase through a door that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. My mother, Carol, passed away that spring at 48 years old. She had chosen to come home from the hospital toward the end, wanting to die in the same front bedroom where her own mother had died. I held her hand through those final hours. My father stood at the window with his back half turned, watching the fields as though they held something he needed more than the moment inside the room. People arrived at the funeral with casseroles and grief they wore, like borrowed clothing. They pressed me close and said she had found peace. I was 16 and still soft enough to believe them. Sharon was the woman's name. She arrived wearing a yellow blouse and moved through the house with a quiet certainty that unsettled me more than any argument could have. Within weeks, my mother's handmade quilts were packed into the attic. Curtains the color of resignation replaced the ones in the kitchen. The china that had passed through generations of Hale women disappeared into a cupboard no one touched. Sharon was never harsh about it. She had a gentler method, a warm smile in a room full of relatives, a soft remark that only I felt land. One morning, I found her at the kitchen table, sorting through my mother's handwritten recipe cards. When I asked her to leave them alone, she folded her hands and told me, in the most patient voice imaginable, that I was a guest in the house now. I was standing in the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to roll biscuits. The word guest reached somewhere in me that grief had not yet touched. I left the day after my 18th birthday, not in fury, but with the quiet resignation of someone who has finally stopped pretending they still belong. I enrolled in a community college 2 counties away, then completed a paralegal program, because the law was the only place I had discovered where language could not be softened into something harmless. Words in a deed meant exactly what they said. A record properly filed could outlive everyone who wished it away. I built a modest life in Cedar Falls, about 40 minutes from the farm, renting an apartment with 1 good chair and working for a probate attorney named Karen Whitfield, who had a talent for reducing family catastrophes to their documentary origins. My father called on birthdays. Sharon answered sometimes, her voice consistently warm in the particular way that communicates its opposite. I told myself the farm could wait, that I would address it when things were calmer, when I was more prepared. That is the quiet lie that careful, responsible people rehearse to avoid the pain of action. The Hale place was the last thing on earth that still held something of my mother in its walls, and I spent 16 years telling myself there would be time to return to it. There was not. My father died on a Tuesday, 3 months ago. At 68, I learned about it through a voicemail. Sharon had already selected the funeral home, the hymns, the casket, and the burial plot, not the Hale family cemetery where my mother rested, but a town cemetery in Brant that had no memory of either of us. I arrived at the service in a black dress I had purchased that morning. A cousin I barely recognized leaned over and asked whether I was family or a colleague from work. Nobody had reserved me a seat. Sharon spoke for 10 minutes at the podium, called my father the love of her life, and pressed a handkerchief to her eyes at precisely the right intervals. Her son Cody occupied the front pew, scrolling his phone between hymns, wearing a suit that fit him better than sorrow did. At the reception, Sharon accepted condolences beside the coffee urn, and when I came to say my farewell, she took both my hands and told me he was at peace now. The same phrase strangers had offered me for my mother, 16 years earlier. The drive back to Cedar Falls in the dark left me crying in a way that was more rage than mourning. I was grieving 2 parents, simultaneously the mother I had lost at 16, and the father I had lost, in truth, the afternoon a stranger first climbed out of his truck. What I did not yet understand was that Sharon's composure had a foundation. She believed she had already secured everything. A month after the funeral, she invited me to collect a few of my father's belongings. She left a single cardboard box on the porch. the way a package is left by a delivery driver, and watched from behind the beige kitchen curtains as I carried it to my car. Inside were 3 flannel shirts, his reading glasses, a coffee mug, and an old canvas barn coat that still held the smell of hay and diesel. That night, going through the coat's pockets more from habit than any expectation, my fingers found an envelope tucked behind a torn seam in the interior breast pocket. It had gone soft with age. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting, that familiar slanted cursive I had last seen on recipe cards. Sharon had sorted through at our kitchen table. I sat down on the floor of my apartment with my back against the armchair and held the envelope for a long time before opening it. It was dated 3 days before she died. She wrote that she was sorry to leave me while I was still so young. She wrote about watching me learn to roll biscuits at that table and hoping I would always carry a sense of where I came from. And then one line that I read again and again until the ink blurred and reformed. The land knows you. Monica, you came up out of this ground the same as your grandmother did. Whatever happens, don't let anyone tell you that you are a guest on it. She had understood, before she died, exactly what was coming, and she had left me a direction. 16 years early, toward the single question I had never once thought to ask. The question became urgent when Cody posted the farm listing online, wide-angle photographs of every room, a drone shot of the back 40 labeled Endless Potential, and his own caption featuring a row of money symbols. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the asking price and felt something inside me go still and sharp. The same focus I brought to Karen's files when a document refused to reconcile. Sharon was selling my mother's family farm openly, confidently, before my father had been in the ground a full season. And the paralegal part of my mind asked the question I had spent 16 years, too exhausted and too grief-struck to raise. Could she actually do that? Whose name was on the deed to the Hale place? Monday morning, before my shift, I opened the Morrow County Recorder's online index, the same database I used a dozen times each week, and entered the parcel number printed right there on the listing. The screen returned a list of recorded documents stretching back decades. Deeds, satisfied mortgages, a survey from the 70s. My great-grandfather's name. My grandmother's name. And then, recorded the year I was born. My mother's name alone, Carol Hale. The farm had been hers, not my father's, not theirs, hers, held as separate property. Inherited before she ever married. The law does not concern itself with whose boots have worn down the porch steps. It concerns itself with whose name appears on the instrument. When my mother died without a recorded will and with no deed of transfer, the property had remained legally suspended, her ownership simply sitting in the index like a held breath, followed by 16 years of silence. I drove to the county seat in Brant and asked the clerk for certified copies of the full chain of title. Then I spread the documents across the long oak table in the records room and read them in sequence, the way you approach something that might detonate. That night I pulled up the state probate statutes. When a married woman dies without a will while holding separate real property, our state does not transfer the whole of it to the surviving spouse. It divides it. Where a surviving spouse and one child both exist, each receives an undivided 1/2 interest. I read the provision 3 times, the day they lowered my mother into the ground. The law had quietly assigned me a 1/2 interest in the Hale farm. No one had told me. No one had opened probate, filed a partition, or recorded a clean conveyance. My father had simply continued living there. Then a stranger had continued living there. And the years had accumulated over my legal claim the way snow accumulates over a fence post invisibly, weightlessly, without erasing what lies beneath. 2 days later, Cody called. He had not reached out in years. His voice carried the careful friendliness of someone reading from a prepared script. He said the sale was moving along well, and that the title company had a small paperwork item to clear up a formality. He called it. He needed me to sign a quitclaim deed, just to tidy the file. I knew what a quitclaim deed was. I knew that a title company flags ownership discrepancies, and that what Cody was describing as a formality was in fact a request for me to surrender the 1/2 interest my mother's death had given me. I kept my voice even and told him I would be happy to review whatever they sent over. He asked me not to make things complicated. I said I read documents for a living, and it would be strange not to. He ended the call without saying goodbye. In the silence that followed, I understood two things at once. They had known about my half all along, and they had counted on me remaining the 16-year-old who signed whatever the adults placed in front of her. I was not her anymore. The land had remembered my name, exactly as my mother said it would. And I had finally, after all this time, learned to read the paper.